Hi, I'm Angela Fehr. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to paint this beautiful winter scene in watercolor featuring this gorgeous red barn. This tutorial is filmed in real time so you can take your time and paint along with me. If you're wanting to build your skills in rendering a structure, we're going to talk about techniques for making a stronger drawing before you start painting, and then we're going to go right into basic watercolor techniques, glazing and layering, color selection and color mixing, as well as simplifying your subject so that you don't have to get locked into painting every detail. My favorite technique that we cover today is how to add those little finishing touches that really bring your painting to life and give it a more polished and professional look. Before we get started, go ahead and hit the subscribe button below the video. I know you're going to love this tutorial and want to see more of my watercolor videos and tutorials that I share here on YouTube. Let's get started. The first challenge in painting any object is really learning to outthink your brain, because we have this thing that we do and we're trained to do it from the time we're children to reduce everything to symbols. So that's why we start when we're small drawing houses that are squares with triangles on top and lollipop trees, and everything gets reduced to something that's symbolic that we've been trained to identify. And that's not a bad thing, but it does mean that when you start learning to paint, it can be a little bit hard to get past that tendency to reduce everything to symbols. I have here a watercolor field book. It's made by Pentalic, and it is cold pressed professional grade watercolor paper. That's what it says on it. But what it doesn't say is what always concerns me when it comes to using watercolor sketchbooks. There's no mention here of cotton paper, which in fact it says paper sourced from certified sustainable forests. So we know this is a cellulose paper, and cellulose paper doesn't take watercolor nearly as beautifully as cotton, 100% cotton paper does. In our situation here, because we're just right now doing some prep work and sketching, we're not going to worry about that. I just would encourage you to be aware that the quality of paper you're finding in a sketchbook isn't going to be the same as you might source with watercolor blocks or loose sheets of watercolor paper, which is what I prefer. We have our drawing done. I'm going to grab this Princeton Elite round brush to use for my painting. This is a number 10, which is a really nice size for sketching. I like to pre-fill my palettes with tube paints. Let them dry. I find there's less waste. You're not rinsing nearly as much paint away in your paint water. I'm going to go a little bit browner with that. That's quinacridone coral. Let's add some burnt sienna, just to see if that gives it a little more brownness. Actually, that was a little too orangey. We'll try the burnt umber. That's a little bit better. And I think I'm even going to dab in a tiny bit of violet just to mute it just a little bit more. And I've got an ultramarine violet here I've been wanting to try. So we're going to start just by pulling the brush along the edge of our drawing. On this side here, there's actually a little dark window in the corner that I'm going to just ignore completely. And we'll start just with that one line of color. And once I've placed that first wash of color, I just use a damp brush, and I've dabbed most of the moisture off with my paper towel so I can just pull the color across. And we're going to work in sections. So we're going to do this side of the barn first. And by pulling the color across, I create a nice smooth transition. I can actually create the beginnings of some shadow on my barn here. Although I know that I can layer over after this has dried to create a richer, darker value. We're just positioning our colors at this point. And I really like to pull with the tip of my brush along the edge of my lines. It works so much better than using short little dabbing strokes, which I've seen people do, and then you get kind of a bumpy edge. And down here I kind of had drawn a little bit of snow mounded up, and it's actually mounded along the edge of the fence, so I'm gonna make it a little bit smaller of a pile than I had originally drawn. I'm gonna get a little closer to the fence than I planned. Now, one thing I want to mention as well is that as you're painting, this is just a small area we're filling in, but if you're filling in a larger area, it's really important to work so that your paint doesn't dry and leave lines where those different pieces. If I were to paint this little shape here and then move over here and paint, this edge would dry and show as a mark on my painting. And I really don't want to do that. I want to have a nice smooth transition all the way across my barn. I can work on figuring out how to create board textures and so forth later on. But right now I'm just painting in my lightest value, so the lightest colors in the lightest shade of red in the painting, and I'm going to go back over the red in the areas that need to be shadowed after it's dried. We're being quite controlled here. This is working with ultimate control. You want to use much less water and paint, and you just so that your color doesn't move a lot. The more water you use when you're painting, the more your color is going to move and flow. And at this, with working with this kind of detail, we want to have some control. So we work with a little more restraint. And I'm just looking at, referring to my reference photo. It's called a reference photo because we refer to it to fill in those reds. My barn is quite bright and light here. The quinacridone coral is a coral. It's a red, but it's got a little bit of an orangey tone and a little bit of a pinky tone. So it's kind of a nice, versatile shade of red to work with. And we have some little bushes and trees kind of popping up in our painting here, and so I'm going to leave a few little white spots. And again, now that I'm moving along the edge of the building, I want to pull down with my brush. And because I'm left-handed, that means I might risk putting my hand in the wet paint. So I have to be really careful about that. And ordinarily, I would actually try to work, when I remember, I try to work from right to left so that I don't drag my hand across that dry, wet paint. And just again looking between my fence boards to figure out where the red comes down. I haven't painted my door at all on either side of the building, the door on the side of the building or this window door opener. This barn is actually at my sister's house and it's been completely renovated since I took this photo. Now I'm just mixing up, I want to take my quinacridone red and mix up a darker shadow color. And whenever we think of shadows, we tend to think of blue. Shadows as always being blue, but they really aren't. What happens with shadows is there's diminished light in that area. And so you have the original color with less light, which does usually cool it off and create that bluer tone. But because it's a red, and we're also going to see some violet in there. The red is still there. And we have just decreased light giving us more coolness to our red, as well as a darker value. And whenever I use the word value, I'm just talking about how light or dark a color is. So light values, light colors, dark values, dark colors. And it means I didn't have to change my red color either. I just was able to go add to it and create a darker value using my ultramarine violet. And those original lines that I drew are helping me out here, knowing where my brush should go. But I'm also working hard to remember to leave space for those little white gaps. And over on this side, we have some shadow. So we're going to actually go right over the quinacridone coral with our new shadow color. And once I've kind of gone around it, I can take my damp brush. I've dabbed off most of the moisture now, so it's a thirsty brush. It's going to suck the color from one place and pull it to the next place. And I can take my time doing that. I can start adding shadow color, which I'm going to do right here. A little more ultramarine violet. So I can start by adding my shadow red along the edge, and then I can vary, and that's called a glaze. It's a transparent layer of color, and then I can soften that edge with a damp brush and pull that color down a little bit. Just give it a really gentle transition. If I decide that transition's too gentle, I can go back and add another layer of color, as many layers as I want over top until I get the value that I want. With watercolor, we have a tendency to want to go too dark, not leave our lights. So I try to be restrained in how much dark value I place. Also being aware though that I can be too timid with the colors I choose, with the contrasts between my values. So I want to have, this is an overcast day, there's not a lot of light, so the shadows aren't super strong. But if I want to have strong contrasts, I need to have a strong balance, a strong contrast between my light and my dark. So I'm just painting in the shadows that I see in my reference photo. I see a line here, and I see more shadow than I painted, so I go back over this area, maybe with a little bit more dark value. And if my lines feel too harsh, that's what that damp brush is for, softening it out, giving it a chance to flow. Now let's go back to this little door. It is a door. Some of my red, I tried to leave some red there so that I didn't have to remix, because that's hard to match colors when you've used up what you have. And I don't think I'm doing a perfect job of matching colors or of leaving white space. It's really hard to do in those tiny areas, and we'll talk about how to tidy that up towards the end of the painting. I don't use white paint, so I want to be careful to leave enough whites so that my door details still stand out. Don't want to lose my whites. One of the beautiful things about watercolor, and the thing that you really can enjoy and celebrate as you're painting, is the transparency. It's the way we can add layers of color and create that texture and add detail and a real richness of color as we're painting. And that's one of my favorite things to do. I like to explore that and celebrate it in my paintings. So we've done the barn itself. We're going to give it a minute to dry, and while we're waiting, we're going to paint some of our surroundings here. I don't like to just walk away if there's more that I can do. So I'm going to grab some, this is lavender from Daniel Smith. It's a beautiful wintry blue, and you could mix your own with some violet and cobalt. And we just want to give that illusion of wintry trees without painting all the trees. So we're just going to keep the side of the brush to fill an area quickly and see if we can keep it as simple as possible. The focus here is the barn, it's the fence, it's the focal point trees. So with that lavender, and let's just pull along the roof line to make sure we don't overlap there. We want that roof line to stand out nice and white. So we'll actually make our lavender a little bit darker where it touches the roof. And that should help our white roof pop. And then back to the side of the brush to create those distant trees. We've got near trees as well. And by glancing at them, looking at them in my reference photo, I can see that they do come across as darker than my background trees. And that's helpful to know because that means I can take my brush and go right across where those trees are going to go and not have to worry about painting around them, which can be tedious and time consuming. And I'm a lazy loose painter. Okay, so we have just the basics there for some distant trees. If we wanted to maybe make them feel more wintry yet, yeah, I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to grab a little bit of indigo just to give a little more of, whoop, that's really dark. Let's see if we can get away with it. I want to give a little bit more of the appearance of distant trees with some tree trunks. So I placed that indigo, and down here where it's dry it didn't bleed much. So I'm going to soften that and then pull some tree trunk shapes up. Anytime you go in with a dark color like that, it's a little bit scary. It's a commitment. And because my lavender is still wet, it's going to give some fuzziness, which I think will work for that look of trees. And layers and depths in the background. And then I got lazy and just wiggled it in over there. This is a sketch. We're just trying out ideas in preparation for that serious painting, so we can get away with that. Now I'm going to, I think, grab some of the lavender again, but this time we're going to mix it with a little bit of cobalt teal, which is a lovely turquoisey blue. And that's going to give me some shadow snow color. Using a color that I've already chosen keeps my colors unified in my painting. And that's helpful so that I don't have any glaring kind of disharmony between my colors. Sometimes I think we see that there's like a light blue in one area and a dark blue in another, and so we feel like we need to choose two completely different blues. But you're much better off choosing a base blue and saying, okay, the other blue is maybe a darker value, maybe it's slightly warmer, so you add a tiny bit of maybe a red to it, maybe it's slightly cooler, so you add a little bit of a turquoise to it. But it's still related to and connected to the first color on the paper. Just putting in a little bit of snow. I'm exaggerating because in my photo I don't actually see a lot of shadow on my snow. So I wanted to put in a little bit more than what is there. And that's one of the limitations of reference photos, is that they tend to flatten color. They don't show all the subtleties that our eyes could see. And so it's really helpful to know that so that you can feel free to exaggerate a little bit. And the blue of that cobalt teal and the lavender actually I think will look really nice for my roof on my barn as well. So we're going to do that right now. I believe the reds are dry enough. We're going to start by putting in that line. That basically goes straight across. This top part of the roof really doesn't have any tin showing, and so we don't see anything but white along the top. And then the bottom side, that's where we see that snow coming down. And it's just kind of an irregular line where the blue comes forward. And we also see, if you look carefully, this is your powers of observation again, I can see the shadow created where the snow touches the roof, so I can go a little darker along this edge. Maybe even a little darker along this edge. And that just helps my barn just take shape so much more. The other thing I see is just a little bit of a shadow on the snow kind of mounted on the roof line here. So I'm just going to put a hint of a blue mark there. You're not even going to see it on the video. It's just that subtle. And now I think, I was going to say we really do have to wait, but I actually think we can put in our fence line. And for that I'm going to use my cobalt teal. I'm going to make a little puddle of it here with that snow or that roof blue that I used and actually don't really need anymore. And this brush I believe has a fine enough point that I don't need to go to a smaller brush. And it's really nice to have a brush that holds a lot of paint and goes to that fine point. We're going to go even darker with our cobalt teal. This turquoise is really going to pop against the beautiful coral of the barn itself. And again, pulling with my brush, making sure when I get to the tree here that I leave a space for tree trunk. We haven't talked about our fence posts. They're actually behind the fence boards that we can see on this side, so I can paint my boards straight across without stopping. There's actually a shadow on the fence boards where the snow is mounted on the top board, so I might decide to go back and place that shadow. Anytime we can see those variations, instead of just putting down one flat color, we're going to have a more realistic looking painting, a little more depth. And if your line is slightly crooked, well, we know it's the fence's fault. Clearly it needs some repairs. At this stage, it would be easy to feel like we're mostly done. I'm waiting still here for my trees to dry enough that I can paint them. So I'm actually going to walk away and give my painting about 30 minutes to dry. It does dry fairly fast on this cellulose paper. And then when I come back, we're going to add the finishing details that are going to make our barn come to life. If I were to come back and paint this as a looser version, which is my preferred method, having this inside information on how the barn is structured and where everything is positioned helps me paint more confidently in my signature loose style. It's important for me to have that I have the ability to see all those details, to be able to paint that structure in realism, even though my style has evolved to something looser, and I'll be able to paint the barn in a few more expressive strokes because I have confidence that I know all those elements that make it up. We're going to add the finishing details that are going to make this little sketch look complete. I think it's important to take a break during the watercolor painting process. It gives your brain a chance to catch up with what your hands have been doing. And often we have these blind spots in our painting, as I mentioned before, that we just need a little time and space and distance to see. So the one thing I noticed here is as I came back to the painting, I immediately felt like there's this big white space along the edge, or basically along the whole fence line, because I do have the barn coming down behind the fence, but nothing else. So I need to put my fence posts in, and also I think a few twigs and shadows just to tie those elements together and unify it with the rest of the painting. My barn also still feels flat, needs a little bit more three-dimensionality. So I'm going to be going in to add some darker contrasts in my shadows. That's going to push the shadows back and help the light values pop forward. And I'll show you how to do that. And I think for that we probably will be breaking out the tiny brush. But before we do that, we're going to paint our big trees and just get them positioned in the painting. For that I'm going to use some burnt umber, which I did actually use a hint of in my barn, so it's not a complete introduction of a new color. And I'm going to use some indigo, which was also in my distant trees, so that's also going to be a unifying color and create those connections to our elements. So we start with our trunk here, And where it lands on the ground, we have a little nest of snow, so we'll let that kind of guide where we position the bottom of the trunk. And then I'm just going to pull up, and from there we have all kinds of branches coming out. Now the trick here, and it can be really hard to paint branches and have them look organic. Our hand tends to do this whole little soldier thing that is not pleasing to the eye. So what I like to do is use this brush. This is the Scroggy's Loose Goose Dagger Striper from Cheap Joe's Art Stuff, and it is so much better at painting unpredictable lines. It's just got a little flex and bendiness to it. That's really helpful. The other thing I try to remember, pull away from the tree so that your lines start wider as you press the brush down, and then lift as you pull, and that'll give you that thick to thin shape. And the other thing you want to do is lighten your value as you pull away from the tree. Thin branches are going to look lighter and less silhouetted than the darker, thicker ones. So we start dark towards the trunk where the branches cluster more tightly, and then we get lighter as we pull away. We also have, I like doing a few dark or a few pale branches that are more distant branches. They're pointing away from the tree, and then a few that are darker. And by changing our values, dark and light, we get a lot more sense of three-dimensionality and distance. So those are some things to think about. The other thing is, remember that when you're painting, you're always symbolizing. You're not making a tree, you're symbolizing a tree. So that means, and I'm going to go back to this round brush as I paint this other tree. If you're painting a symbolic tree, that means you don't have to paint every branch that you see. You have the freedom to simplify. And that's an important thing to remember. And because we didn't put any details in our distant trees, these are all the branches we're painting today. And so we want to, I just want to remember that, keep that in mind. I'm going to paint until they look balanced, and then I'm going to stop. And I'm actually going to go into my indigo, put a little straight indigo into my tree here. That's going to give a little dark moodiness. And again, add to that sense of three-dimensionality. Super darks, light values, thin lines, thick lines, variety. Now let's pull that down a little bit. And you know what else is going to help those trees to look like they belong in this painting? Adding a few little twigs. So we're going to pull that. I've choked up on my brush just so I have a little bit more control of those long bristles. And then I can just go in, pull up a few little twigs sticking out of the snow here. And then in the back behind, well, there's actually one in front of my fence on this side. So we balance, and that's going to really balance things out. Just by placing that there, it's like a mini version of these guys over there, and that's really helpful. And then maybe a little bit over here. And this time I'm going to try to kind of loosely suggest that it's behind the fence. Okay, that one got a little bigger than I planned, but that's okay. And just those few little elements can really help. It's going to fix my fence issues, my little gappy fence that I had. And it's going to make my trees fit within the painting, the style of tree that I've painted, and the colors that I've used. Yeah, I could even decide that I want to have a nearer tree on this side if I felt like I really needed to balance things more, and paint it on, you know, kind of alongside the barn. It's artistic license to go in and do those additional things that help your painting feel more successful, help guide your viewer through the scene. My brush, I should mention too, my brush strokes here for my trees are mostly quite rounded. They're not really sharp and spiky and straight. Different artists use different brush styles. If you're a stabby, straight strike brush stroker, you're certainly, that's your style, and you should feel very free to roll with that and do your own signature tree shapes. And mark making can be a really fun thing to practice in your studio warm-ups. Now I've got this little Princeton number 4 long round, which I love using for signing my name, but I'm going to use it here today for adding those final details to my barn as well. And I'm actually going to sit down. Most of the time when I paint, I'm standing up, and by sitting, I'm just going to be a little closer to my painting, and I'm going to have a little bit more control. Standing up helps me keep a loose body language as I'm painting. Things that need more control, that's not going to be my priority. So I'm mixing some indigo with my quinacridone coral right now. And that's giving me a really nice brick colored kind of violet-y color. Brick violet, sure, we'll call it that. And I'm getting really close to my photo as well and looking for those little details, the little darkest darks that are gonna create the three-dimensionality I need in my barn. And I'm seeing a really nice dark line here where the roof line of the little porch is. So we're gonna do that right away and see if that makes my barn look a little crisper and more 3D. And it juts under like so. And then there's some dark values in here too. There's kind of, I don't know if they're, I think they're twigs or wires or ropes. We're not really sure. And then along the edge of the door, I can paint in my shadows as well. And I know there's going to be a shadow because my reference photo tells me so, where the slats, the crisscross slats of the door cast a little narrow line. So I can look for that and paint it in. And you'll notice I'm not softening this time. I'm using this tiny fine brush so that I have lots of control. And I'm just putting in a really thin line. I might need to soften in a few places. So I just placed a line here that went down a little darker than I wanted. So what I did was I blotted my brush, and that puts it in thirsty brush mode, and then I can just lift that little bit of excess paint, and that's really helpful. Rather than panicking and erasing the line entirely, I just lightened it up just a little bit with that thirsty brush. Now I'm seeing definitely more three-dimensional feeling in that little porch there. Now we want to make the rest of the painting match. So we're going to just move along to the roof line, and it's going to go down quite a bit darker than my reference photo shows at first. Pull back and take a look. I think I still want to soften that. So that's where the thirsty brush comes in to do its work. Just a damp brush to soften that edge and pull the color down. And now I've talked about the fact that as a loose painter, I spend very little time now in my own personal practice doing detail work like this. But this was how I learned watercolor for many years. I spent hours and hours working on trying to make things look more three-dimensional, learning how to soften edges, add those shadows. I'm just painting a little bit of the vertical texture of the siding here with just a few thin lines of my brush. Not every plank, but just a few lines to suggest those textured boards. Down here I see a little more shadow than what my paint is telling our viewers, so we're going to darken that up a little bit with some of this is actually our original shadow color. So I'm fussing a little bit, but that's allowed. So we have a line coming right across here. We have a line coming in here, which isn't really a thin line, it's just more of just a shadow again, more contrast. So again, moving that color, spreading it out a little bit with my brush. Put it in place. And then a little tidy line can make such a huge difference in your painting. Just adding in, seeing those little shadows and placing them. Now I talked about this fact that this area has a few flaws. I didn't do a very good job with my door on this side. And so there's a couple things you could do to resolve this. On this side, I lost my white plank completely right here. I'm going to try to lift it out. I'm just dampening that area with my brush, right where that plank should be. And then with my paper towel, go in and lift. And that actually might get me right to what I need. And a cellulose paper actually lifts a little bit better than a 100% cotton paper, which is generally more absorbent. And as long as that's damp, I can't go back in and touch it, so I have to wait for it to dry, and then I can go back in and tidy up those lines if I wish to. Again, a fairly dry brush helps us paint with more control. And here we can also paint some lines to help give texture to our roof. And I think one thing that happens here, I'm sitting down, I'm working close to my painting. Make sure you take breaks to pull back and take a look at the painting as a whole. If this is working really well, then it doesn't matter so much if this little area isn't working great or if this area isn't quite balanced. You want to be focused on getting your painting to feel complete, not for each element to be perfect. We're not aiming for perfection. We just want to make it look finished and unified. And so so I'm pulling back from the barn again, giving this window a chance to dry so I can just touch up that area. And then we'll put those fence posts in. Let's see what else we need to do. Okay, so fence posts, and they're a really dark color. We're going to use a similar dark, kind of a cross between the tree dark and the barn dark, and see if that works for what we're doing. We have one fence post kind of here. So we have a mark there, coming straight down, another one there. And it looks black in the photo. I want to mention that just because something looks black doesn't mean it should be black. In fact, if we make those too dark, they're going to command too much attention. So I've placed them as a near black, but I'm actually going to just blot with my brush and lighten them a little bit so they just don't grab your eye as the first thing that you see. Actually, the fence post on this side actually is a little paler. I have a link to where you can download this reference photo so you can work with it and be able to see it in more detail than what you're seeing on my screen. So make sure you check that out in the description below the video, as well as my list of links to supplies that I'm using in today's lesson. And I also have some dark bits and pieces in the background that it's always hard to know how much of that to add. So again, placing color and then lifting slightly will help create kind of some interest and filler without taking over the entire painting. By blotting, we just kind of subdue and tone it back. But I actually think there's like a gate there or something. That's why we're not seeing the fence post. So we'll put in the next one over here. And then the next one closer to the trees, right about there. And then we'll lift those both. Just a slight blot. Finally, still looking at the big picture. What does this painting need? Not a lot. I think just a few more little twiggies over in this side. Let's try using this skinny brush and see if I can just create a little bit more of a filler for that background space, so it doesn't look empty, like a hole. And there's no reason why your watercolor painting needs to be 100% full of paint. It's a good idea to leave some white space, especially of course in a snow scene. That's a lot easier to do. But leaving that white space helps make your painting just look a little bit more watercolory. It helps showcase the beauty of the watercolor. Now, because we left a gap for the snow along the top of the fence rail, we want to put a shadow to show that it's hanging over. And this seems like kind of an unimportant detail. Really, there's going to be very few people that are actually going to pay so much attention to your painting that they're noticing that there's snow sitting on the railing. It's actually pretty hard to see in the reference photo. Unless you're studying it, it can actually look like distant snow instead of railing snow. But we're getting detailed, so we'll spend a little bit of time on it, not too much. And it's a good idea to just say what's the most important thing about this painting. It helps you to not get fixated on small things that nobody's going to notice. Okay, let's pull back and take a look at the painting as a whole. I think this is working actually quite well. Couple of things. We talked about proportion, we talked about observation at the very beginning of the lesson, and I really didn't get a perfect rendition of what the reference photo actually shows. The barn is slightly turned more toward us. This edge of the barn is bigger than it actually shows in the reference photo. So I didn't get my proportions perfectly, but they're close enough that it works as a whole. And so I can feel fairly satisfied in it. My plan now is to take this scene and paint it again. Paint it as many times as I need to feel confident in my subject matter and comfortable with painting a looser variation of the same scene. One thing we didn't do, and that's where I talk about blind spots, we didn't go back and finish this little barn window. Let's do that. Okay, so it hasn't dried to pure white, but that's okay. When I place my dark values, and just zip it up along the edge of the barn there, it actually can make that pale pink look almost white in my finished painting with that contrast. So the darker your darks are, the brighter your lights are going to look. So I can use that to my advantage here. If I really did feel the need to go back to pure white, I still wouldn't resort to white paint at this stage. What I would plan to do is get a little bit of tape and magic eraser. I could lay 2 strips of tape down, just revealing that place I wanted to lift, and rub it with my magic eraser to lift out the paint. The magic eraser is a microfiber scrubber, so it really can do quite a good job of lifting paint without harming the paper. You still want to be careful with it, not scrub for too long, but that is an option. And then if that didn't work, another thing I could try is once the paper is completely dry, I could use a sharp blade to scratch out my white, since it's just a thin line. All in all, I had fun getting to know this barn, and I look forward to trying a looser variation in a future lesson. If you enjoyed this lesson, take a moment and just hit the subscribe button in the corner of your screen. From there you can travel through my channel and see many more watercolor tutorial videos and demonstrations. If you want to fall even further into my watercolor world, visit angelafehr.com, where you can sign up to become part of my watercolor community, my mailing list, and learn about my online courses where you can go even more in depth in growing your watercolor skills and becoming your own favorite artist. Thanks for watching. See you soon.